They said the man wants to be a king. He wants to take over the country. He is not to be trusted. All right, Adams supporters. What can you say about Jefferson? No, I know it's all about that slave, Sally Hemings, but that was brought up. But that was not the subject of big debate. This is what got the attention in New England, that Jefferson might not be your man. He's an atheist. And if you vote for him, he's coming up here and taking your Bibles, and he's going to burn all your Bibles. You know, Americans, as educated as we are, we'll just believe most anything. You know, it's a fascinating thing. Americans will believe a lot. So, you know, you've got the Bible-burning atheist over here. You've got the monarchist over here. And the electoral vote does take place. So, in the electoral vote here, let's see if I can get... this computer just is simply absolutely not going to cooperate. And I actually had some good slides today. All right, so much for that. I will tell you what the slides say in the electoral vote. The electoral vote was counted, and there was, the tie was, I think it was 73 to 73 for Jefferson and Aaron Burr. John Adams is a distant third. So to break the tie, it's going to the House of Representatives. Now, this whole rigmarole doesn't take place until February 1801, and according to the Constitution, the new president's supposed to be sworn in on March the 4th. So you don't have a whole lot of time here to dilly-dally with this, because you've only got a month to get this settled. So when it gets to the House of Representatives, it is not a victory. Now, the way that this worked, you've got 16 states by 1801. Tennessee is now a state by this point in the proceedings. So technically, you should have 32 votes here, 16 and 16. So to have a majority of 16, you've got to have a vote of 9. And in the first vote in the House, Jefferson got 8 and Burr got 8. Now, Maryland and Virginia Maryland and Vermont could not vote because their state delegation in the House was tied. And, you know, if you've got the same number of Federalists in the House as Republicans, then you cancel each other out, so you don't get to vote. So the first vote, 9 is needed to win, and they've got this vote that is 8 to 8. Somebody's got to get 9 votes here in this count. So by midnight on this February the 11th, they have had 19 votes. Some members of these delegations there are sending to their living quarters in the new nation's capital to ask for their blankets and their pillows. They have agreed that they're going to keep voting until they make a decision, that they've got to get this done, and it becomes vote after vote after vote for well over a week. Nobody's going to budge. Now, one of the questions that ought to be going through your mind was if Jefferson and Burr had agreed for Burr to be the vice president, why didn't Burr just say, I'm the vice president, you all vote for Jefferson? And this is one of the great mysteries of history. And, you know, because history treats Aaron Burr very badly, we tend to forget that he was a very debonair campaigner. He was personable, far more personable, and far more of a handshaker and a deal maker than the ethereal, mysterious Jefferson was. You know, what was the book that Joseph Ellis wrote about him? American Sphinx. You know, nobody really knew who he was. So I think Burr was kind of enjoying it. Now, here's where the trouble starts. People began looking at these two, and a lot of folks are saying, well, if we've got to pick one of these, maybe we'd rather have Burr rather than Jefferson. And so that starts the rumor mill going. And so Jefferson gets very nervous, won't listen to anybody, and he says, you know, if we're going to have a usurpation of the president, that word was in the Declaration of Independence, a takeover of the office of this government here. And so Jefferson just cannot abide what's going on. And the tension is so incredibly high. There is a great deal of fear that civil war is going to break out here. Jefferson happens to run into President Adams on the street. They carry on a conversation. Jefferson threatens to not that he will use force if necessary to prevent anybody other than himself from being president. And, you know, it's no wonder the day that Jefferson was sworn in as president that John Adams had left town early and refused to stay, because there was this threat of military violence taking place. So with all of this tension, finally, Alexander Hamilton, who had stabbed, figuratively speaking, John Adams in the back, and prevented Adams from really winning in the first place in this election, Hamilton, who despises Aaron Burr, finally starts working behind the scenes. And he prevented some of the Federalists from not voting, and so the final vote was 9-6 in favor of Jefferson. So Aaron Burr comes in as vice president. And I think Jefferson despised Aaron Burr after this, because Aaron Burr wouldn't say, oh, I don't want to be president, just support Thomas Jefferson over here. And I think that history had good enough reason to treat Burr badly because of shooting Alexander Hamilton, but I think history has continued to treat him probably worse than his earlier career would suggest that he deserved. So we got through it in 1801 without losing order. It was a peaceful transfer of power. I think in 1801 it probably was a whole lot more ambiguous to the people who were there than it seems to us today. But I think that just like how you're going to feel on November the 9th, above all, everybody was really just glad it was over and done with. So, now I think I've got sound here. I am happy to take comments, questions, anything y'all have to say. You have the floor. I see a hand up over there. I'm supposed to repeat your question after you say it.
Where does the 12th Amendment fit into all
Ah, the 12th Amendment. We'll start there next week. As a result of all of this mess, they realized it wasn't working. And in 1804, So that's where the 12th Amendment came in as a result of this. Okay, another question over here.
Are you going to be able to post your presentation on the OSHA site?
Well, I would like to think that I can post my presentation on the OSHA site, and so I will request that. I will be happy to do that for you. I will certainly give it to Melissa Allen.
Yeah.
Yes.
They'll be posted.
You said there were 12 states.
Oh, and the Constitution, Rhode Island. And you know, when George Washington was sworn in on March the 4th, now 1789, well, he wasn't sworn in on March the 4th, he was sworn in the end of April. In 1789, we only had 11 states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, used to ratify the Constitution. So Washington became president in 1789, the president of the country with only 11 states. So, and you know, those North Carolina people are sort of our ancestors here. So, you know, we came from there, so, you know, we don't like rules much here. And we told them what to do. So, other comments are, oh yes, I see some down in Dale.
I've always heard that the Jefferson-Adams fight was one of the dirtiest campaigns ever. They said awful things to each other, yet it seems like Alexander Hamilton got in there instead. In fact, I didn't know he did that to him.
Yeah.
And then Burr got in there.
Yeah, there was plenty of backstabbing. And I will say this about Jefferson. You know, I love David McCullough's book about John Adams. It really shows that relationship up. McCullough doesn't talk much about the Three-Fifths Compromise, but he does talk about that relationship. And, you know, after Jefferson had gone back to Monticello and Abigail Adams had died, he did, they started communicating again. And you know, I think that friendship was restored, which was really good. Yes,
It's possible suggestion for reading if the Three-Fifths Compromise is not taken place, the other states have hung in there, and the southern coastal states have not gone along with the Constitution.
well, I have a great book to recommend, also on PowerPoint, but I'll tell you what it is. And you, Jim, who is retired now, but he was the principal, the president, the whatever, of the Tennessee School for the Blind, and so I've known Jim for a long time. The book that has the most in it is Gary Will's, Garry Will's book called Negro President. But it has nothing to do with Sally Hemings. The book is about the Three-Fifths Compromise. Any of y'all from Connecticut? Well, you know, one of the people that's the big hero of this Gary Will's book is Thomas Pinckney. And so he was very much against the Three-Fifths Compromise. But that book is really, of all the books, all the biographies of Jefferson and Adams that are out there, that book is by far the best about the compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, you know, another book I read that I didn't really like very much was, and you know, if this is your brother or if your sister or something, I didn't like Edward Larson's book about the election of 1800, which is called Magnificent Catastrophe. He won the Pulitzer a few years ago for a book about the Scopes trial, but this book, it just never really caught fire with me. And he didn't talk much about the Three-Fifths Compromise, but that's a fairly new book that's out there. And I still like those Joseph Ellis books, the biography of Jefferson. I mentioned Passionate, American Sphinx, and the one about Adams is called Passionate Sage. I really like those books. And there's a new biography out of George, well, not really new, but a biography about George Washington that's fairly new out. And Hamilton the musical has made Hamilton a national hero. And this young woman, I will end on this note, an anecdote from the real world where I teach in Ulster. Y'all are not the real world. I love you, but teaching you is not the real world. There's a girl who is not doing well in her history course, came up to me after the test last week and said, "Have you seen the musical Hamilton?" And I said, "Well, I haven't, but I've been asking my husband for my birthday and Christmas for 2 years now for tickets." And so I said, "Did you get to go to New York and see Hamilton?" And she said, "Well, no, but I saw, that's how I studied for your test." She didn't go to, she saw it on YouTube. For the life of me, I cannot imagine watching a Broadway musical, and she probably watched it on YouTube on her phone. But it was not surprising to me that many of the points of all of this had gone right over her head from getting her history lesson from a YouTube video. I will see you next week.
Morning. Hi. I regret to say we're having some technical difficulties. This screen doesn't seem to want to come up. So we've tried everything we know at this point. So if you all want to see if there's some empty seats and shift over this direction, or technology is great except when it's not. So anyway, if you all want to shift, we're... Oh, is it? Woo! All right. Welcome to intermittent technology. So we'll see what happens. Life is full of surprises. I'm Betsy Carole, president of OLLI, and welcome. For the new members, would you raise your hand? Those the first time. Whoa, welcome. Really. Delighted to have you. Also, in the back of the room, anybody who has a yellow ribbon, this time it is Kathy West, who's our classroom assistant. So if you have questions or if we ever have handouts, these are the people, the volunteers who are really helpful, and we appreciate that very much. Quick thing, October 22nd, our fall day trip. If you still want to sign up, great. Please turn off cell phones. And now for the program. In this week's news, political journalists are claiming we've hit a new low in candidate behavior. Is that really true? Fortunately, we have the renowned Dr. Carole Bucy, our Davidson County historian, professor of history at Vol State, to put things in perspective. She's going to demystify and expose the behavior of past candidates and campaigns as she takes us through the sound and fury controversial presidential elections. So, before we vote early and often, Dr. Carole Bucy.
We are off again, so I guess we're still working on that one over there. Thank you very much for coming today. It's always a pleasure to be here with you, and it's always interesting to see you. I feel like I know about 75% of you now pretty well, so this is kind of a familiar crowd. This is not as daunting as it once was to get up here and do this, but I have to say the subject matter I picked out and the title of this course in February, and so never did I know exactly where we would be come October. Now, because you all are readers, I will be giving you some book suggestions along the way, and don't worry if you don't get it written down. I'll help you with the books. But I also know that you all are very technologically savvy, except for one small problem here. But I encourage you to get your Constitution, go online and get your Constitution, look up the Constitution, and read what it says about the election of the president, because I think it will really be surprising to you how incredibly complicated the election of the president was always intended to be. Now, complicated is slightly different from what's going on right now, but I'm not a prognosticator of the future. I only will talk about the past here, and you can draw your own conclusions and parallels yourselves. 12 years ago, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia became very concerned that Americans did not know American history, United States history, it should properly be called, that we did not know our history, but in particular, he was really shocked at how little people understood about the Constitution. So working with some other members of the Senate, including Tennessee's Lamar Alexander, they got a bill passed through Congress and signed by President Bush that created Constitution Day, which is now celebrated or acknowledged on September 17th every year. And all public educational institutions from kindergarten through postgraduate are supposed to do something related to the Constitution to increase awareness of what's in the Constitution. And never do we really need more of this education about what's in it and what's not in it and what was the founders had in mind than we do today. So before I start talking about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, I think we need to have a little brief review here about what's in the Constitution and what the founders had in mind when they were putting this thing together. So this is the review just to bring you back up to speed on all of this. As you know, after the Revolutionary War, what the 13 states thought they wanted, which was to be 13 little bitty states, countries, didn't work out too well. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was tremendous confusion. There was a legislative body, but it had almost no authority to do anything. There was no executive branch, and so whoever was the presiding officer of the Confederation Congress ended up being the president or the presiding officer. But people realized pretty quickly that this system wasn't going to work. And even recognizing you've got a problem, you've got to have some sparks along the way for you to say the problem is so bad, we've got to fix it. And so two things happened along the way that really set in motion what became known as the Constitutional Convention. First of all, some Revolutionary War veterans who lived in western Massachusetts were very upset because Massachusetts, they felt, was taxing them exorbitantly for a variety of reasons, and frankly, they didn't have enough money to pay their taxes, so they were either going to lose their farm or be put in jail, or both, as the case was on some occasions. And so, led by Daniel Shays, a veteran, I mean, he was respected enough that George Washington actually gave him one of his swords. Daniel Shays leads this march of veterans on an arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. This really shocked not only the people in Massachusetts, but it shocked the people in other states as well as Massachusetts. Now keep in mind there are a lot of differences from day one between us and the people living in Great Britain. You know, one of the things that we had from day one that really helped us win our independence in the first place was a very high literacy rate. Not only did we have a high literacy rate, but we, thanks to Ben Franklin and a few others as well, we had newspapers being printed very cheaply and distributed up and down the seaboard to the other states. So you knew, if you lived along the coastline, what was going on in the other states. So because of that, word of Daniel Shays' rebellion spread very quickly. And it wasn't really a rebellion. Yeah, these guys had some guns, but they weren't really killing each other. But it terrified the leaders even of the revolution. Now, keep in mind, Daniel Shays is doing what they had all done in 1776. And so people were scared because this created a sense of lawlessness. We are really in a situation where people could get out of control. Angry masses could get out of control. And so a lot of the revolutionary leaders decided that perhaps they really needed to think about a better system to keep order. Now, this is the big question that's been discussed throughout American history, and yes, it's even discussed by the candidates today in a slightly different kind of package. But the question is, how do you create a government that provides its citizens with the maximum amount of liberty and yet keeps order at the same time? And so this whole Revolutionary War was about liberties. That was one of the code words. Our liberty is being assaulted here. And yet you've got to keep order at the same time. So different people in this room have different opinions about the lengths that government needs to go to keep order, and well as the lengths that government needs to go to protect our liberty. And a lawless mob acting on their own was now looked at as a threat to both liberty and order. So the founders took note of Shays' rebellion, because if this could spread into New York and into Pennsylvania, what a serious problem we really would have if these Westerners started assaulting the cities. So that was one problem. And then there were just continual, some petty and some not so petty, arguments between the 13 states. And the one that created sort of the spark of an argument was between Maryland and Virginia over who had the right to the oyster beds in the Chesapeake Bay. And they were debating this, and they couldn't come to an agreement. And of course, you didn't have a judiciary to make that decision. You didn't have an executive branch, so it created some tension. And about 5 states decided they needed to have a meeting to talk about these problems, tensions between one state and another. Where is the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania? All of these things were subjects of debate. So they met in Annapolis, Maryland, and one of the people who came, there were I think only 5 or 6 of the states represented at this Annapolis meeting, but one of the people who showed up was Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton was a man who was upwardly mobile. He was full of energy. He was full of ideas. And he and these other delegates from just a few states said, you know, we can sit here and talk about who gets control of these oyster beds all day long, but the problem really is that the government we created, which we thought was what we really wanted, isn't working. So let's go to the Congress, the Confederation Congress, and let's go to the Congress and get the Congress to call a meeting to strengthen our form of government, the Articles of Confederation. And so that decision was made that they would get Congress to approve having a convention to approve the Articles, to strengthen the Articles. So this meeting was called in Philadelphia for May 1787. And delegates from 12 of the states came. They really wanted to see what was going on as much as anything. Now, you all know something about the Constitutional Convention here, I know, and one of the things that you know is that George Washington presided. Interestingly, George Washington really did not want to go to this meeting, because when the Revolutionary War ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed by Great Britain in 1783 saying, okay, you all are independent, goodbye. When that all took place, Washington resigned his military commission. And so the French newspapers, this is before the French Revolution, the French newspapers said, you know, this man has become the most powerful man on earth by resigning his military commission, stepping down. In other words, he's not making himself the king or the emperor or whatever you want to call him. And so Washington spent, if you've read those biographies of Washington that have come out recently, he has spent a fair amount of time between 1783 and 1787 kind of protecting his reputation. Do you understand what I mean here? He doesn't want to show up at some meeting or sign on to a project that he knows is going to fail. He doesn't want his name associated with this. And I don't think it has anything really to do with ego, but it's just that he is going to be very careful what he agrees to do and what he doesn't. Well, you know, let's face it, folks. If you don't have George Washington, you're not going to have a meeting, right? So there's no George Washington, and they have no meeting. So George Washington very reluctantly agreed to attend this meeting. Now, there's one reason why George Washington from Virginia, slave owner, attended this meeting. And the reason that he did attend this meeting was because he, unlike many other people from Virginia, recognized the importance of a national government that could do something, because as the commander-in-chief of the army during the Revolutionary War, what was his very biggest problem? Paying his soldiers and keeping them fighting in the field, because they thought they worked for North Carolina or Connecticut. They didn't see themselves with a national identity. So Washington understood the importance of a stronger national government. So he comes to the meeting and they finally convene, and you know this part of the story. They decided to throw out the articles, to meet in secret, and to not let any of the information going on in the meetings be leaked out before they had come to some kind of a report that they could present to the Congress. And of course, it didn't take very long for them to say, let's just scrap the Articles of Confederation. Now, this is, again, one reason they wanted to meet in secret. So here comes to this meeting James Madison, a delegate from Virginia. He has already done all his homework. He's got the whole plan laid out for the people who come to this convention. He has got everything worked out. It's showing on the screen up here, but it's not showing on my computer, so that's why I'm doing this kind of funny looking. And I see it's not showing over there either again, so maybe we'll work on that. So James Madison comes in with a plan for a structure of government. Now keep in mind, James Madison had been a student of John Witherspoon at the College of New Jersey. He had been sort of schooled in this system of religious organization of the General Assembly, the Scottish Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church here in the United States, of separation of powers and elected hierarchies of levels of government. So James Madison was well schooled in all of this when he shows up at the convention with his plan, the Virginia plan. And nobody else had thought this that far through, but Madison liked to read. He had a big library. He liked to talk about things, and so he was ready to present his plan. Now, I'm going to give you very quickly a summary of his plan, because one thing that really shows forth in this election of 1800 that we're going to talk about here in a minute is the fact that by all of the compromises that took place on Madison's plan, what was created was really only remotely close to what Madison had come up with. So here you see what the plan was. First of all, you're going to have a national, you all can't see that, can you? Now it's on my screen, but not on your screen. All right, well, it's on my screen. I will just tell you about it. The first thing was that you were going to have the legislature. It was his government was already in three branches: executive, legislature, and judiciary. You're going to have the legislative branch proportioned by the population. Now, do you get that? The bigger your state, the more people you get to have in the Congress, and the more votes you have in Congress. That was important. He was from Virginia, which was one of the more popular states. Within this legislative branch, you're going to have two branches within the legislative branch, two houses, a lower house, the House of Representatives, and an upper house called the Senate, kind of patterned on the Roman Senate. And the way that the Senate would be chosen would be also proportional, but the members of the House would elect the Senate. So again, the number of senators you had was really determined by how big your population was. It was a smaller house, but both of these are going to be determined proportionally. Now, you know this story. Virginia thought this was a great idea. They were one of the bigger states. They weren't expecting California to come along, and they thought this was a terrific idea. The small states absolutely could not abide by this. This was a deal breaker as far as Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island wasn't even there, but as far as New Jersey and other small states were concerned, it was not going to happen that way. The lower house could not elect the upper house. So here comes a representative from New Jersey and says it's got to be equal or we're all going home, and all the small states agreed with him. So you know this story, I'm sure quite well, that they talked and talked and talked, and finally they came up with a compromise. The lower house will be proportional according to population, and the upper house is going to be two senators per state, equal representation and proportional representation. Now, the reason that matters here today is because the Electoral College, which elects the president, the Electoral College is determined how many electors your state gets is determined by the number of representatives you have in Congress. We have 9 right now, and you always add the 2 U.S. senators. So Tennessee has 9 congressmen and 2 senators, so that makes us have 11 electors. Now, California out there, where I guess they must have 48 or 50 congressmen now, they have 48 plus 2 or 50 plus 2. Any of y'all from California? Somebody always is from California. Anyway, you could set me straight on how many congressmen you have. But nonetheless, this was what was worked out at the Senate. And so do you see how that is going to give those small states an edge? Now, what people don't quite understand is that the Constitution said how you pick these electors, the people themselves, you've got the number, how you pick them, how you deal with that is strictly your business, the states. Now, of course, keep this in mind. Who stands to lose the most power in this new, stronger national government? The state legislatures. And so the state legislatures you're going to have to figure out, you're going to have to throw them some bones here and there to give them a job, because they're not going to support this if you don't. So allowing the state legislature to determine how you're going to pick your electors really makes good political sense. So, therefore, in the beginning, when the first election took place in 1788, many of the states had the electors representing districts. And so that if you were an elector from one part of Virginia, you might be for Washington, and if you were an elector from another part, you might be for somebody else. Now, Washington won that election, so there wasn't really anybody running against him. One of the big mistakes that they made when they wrote this whole section of the Constitution about the president and about the Electoral College was that they assumed that the election was always going to ultimately end up in the United States House of Representatives. Now, here's why they thought that. These people were, I wouldn't exactly say they were elitist, but that honestly is what they were. They honestly were educated people. They weren't necessarily really rich, but they saw this notion of having virtuous leadership. And so they did not really understand that sooner or later, because of this upward mobility, again, that we had, that Great Britain and none of the countries of Europe had, that more people are going to demand the right to vote along the way. So they weren't expecting that to happen. So what they put in the Constitution about the Electoral College was the states vote for the electors. And then there is a process where they're sealed and delivered to Washington, or to the capital, which at the very beginning was New York, then Philadelphia, and then Jefferson is sworn in Washington, D.C. So the plan is you get these electoral votes. Every person in the Electoral College casts 2 votes. You have 2 votes. So if you're one of Tennessee's 11, you cast 2 votes. And oh, by the way, if you're a Tennessee senator or representative, you can't be an elector. So you've got 2 votes. And the way that this was going to work was whoever gets the most votes gets to be president, and whoever gets the second most votes gets to be vice president. So that seemed to be fine. And if there is not a majority in the Electoral College, it will then go to the House of Representatives, where the House will make a decision. But in the House of Representatives, if the House is voting for the president, each state will only get 1 vote. So the Electoral College is kind of out the window at that point in the proceedings if it gets to the House of Representatives, which they thought it would get there more often than not, because their idea was every state's going to nominate a favorite son. And then the Constitution required at this time that every person who voted as an elector had to vote for one candidate from a state other than where they live. So the Virginia delegates at the Virginia electors were going to have to vote for somebody in addition to George Washington, and they couldn't vote for Thomas Jefferson because they were both from the same state. But they thought each state would be nominating favorite sons, and then this would get sorted out in the House of Representatives. So all of this, the creation of the Electoral College, the election of the president, all of this was the subject of great debate and the subject of compromise. The most controversial of these many, many compromises that had to be made in order to create this government was the fact that Southerners demanded that their slaves be counted towards the number of representatives they have. Now, this is a funny thing about these Southerners, because up to this point, if you talked about national divisions, it was more than likely it was the East Coast urban areas of the country versus the backwoods folks like us here in the middle of nowhere where we were here. And they saw this division. But now with this meeting, what they're seeing is the division isn't East versus West. It is slave versus non-slave. And the slave owners were absolutely adamant that they be allowed to count their slaves for representation. Now, where did they come up with this idea? Well, they took something that was in the Articles of Confederation and flipped it backwards. In the debate about the Articles of Confederation, there was some discussion of taxation. And one of the things that was put into the Articles was that the Southerners were determined to keep out of the Articles was that for purposes of taxation, property taxes being allocated by state, that slaves being property were counted, and they were determined to be your property, and therefore you're going to pay more taxes. So in that debate, 10 years before the Constitutional Convention, they are debating like crazy whether they're going to count the slaves or not. And Southerners were saying, no, 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 we don't want to count the slaves. We don't want to pay taxes. You know, Southerners don't like taxes. And so they're saying, no, no, no. And the Northerners are saying, yes, it's only fair. And so they finally came up with a compromise that they would count 60% of the slaves. So that's how 3/5 came into the being. So now here are the Southerners saying, look, this is a deal breaker. Either we are allowed to count our slaves for representation or we are going home right now. And this was making a deal with the devil right then and there. Because this compromise, which they argued back and forth, yes, no, and then they finally took this number 3/5 that had been around for property taxation during the Articles of Confederation. They took that number and said, okay, we'll let you count them as 60%. But what that did was really change the course of history, really from the beginning right up to the Civil War. The fact that Southern states did have 2 electoral votes in every state, that compromise that gave equal representation, and the proportional only in the House. So this really gave them an edge. And so this is, you know, you're going to determine the population by this federal census that's going to be counted. And you know, your representatives are going to be based on that count. So here you've got a northern household, and you've got a husband, a wife, and 5 kids. So you've got 7 people towards the total population of New York. All right, a southern household. You've got a husband, a wife, 5 kids. That gets us up to 7. And then you own 300 slaves. So guess what? You're not just being counted as 7, you're being counted as 3/5 of, add 7 to 3/5 of 300 slaves. And this was particularly interesting because at one point there was a senator from South Carolina named Pierce Butler who, as I understand it, he owned almost 1,000 slaves. Can you believe it? And so this meant that the southern states had 1/3 more people in Congress than they really should have had. They had 1/3 more votes in the Electoral College than they should have had. And so this election that we're going to talk about here, really, if the slaves had not been counted in the southern states, there wouldn't have been this fight in the House of Representatives between Burr's people and Jefferson's people, because John Adams would have won re-election outright with the Electoral College. So a lot of American history was affected by this 3/5 compromise. Another little footnote that was added to this while they were talking about all other persons, which meant slaves. I mean, the euphemisms they use to say slavery but not say slavery are quite interesting. But they also put a little clause in there that said, now, Congress cannot abolish the foreign slave trade. This has nothing to do with me selling you my slaves or you selling yours to somebody in South Carolina. Congress cannot abolish the foreign slave trade, bringing slaves from Africa over here and selling them, before 1808. And the year 1808 is specifically in the Constitution. Now, I mention that because let's phrase that in a little different way. What that's really saying is, okay, Southerners, you've got 20 years here. You can bring in as many slaves as you can cram on a boat and get over here in a 20-year period of time and goose up your count. And then, you know, you're going to have a surplus of slaves, and you're going to have a place to market your slaves. So that is how that the Southerners had no problem with Congress ending the foreign slave trade in 1808. Guess who was president? Thomas Jefferson. They had no problem with that because now, with the invention of the cotton gin and this demand for this land south of us in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, West Tennessee, Arkansas, for cotton, you've got a market for slaves and your investment is good. Now, do you understand how that one concept of keeping the value of your commodity high is going to factor into every single state after Tennessee that becomes a state? Missouri, Southerners said it's got to be a slave state. Texas, got to be a slave state. California, 1850, Southerners are saying if it's a free state, we're leaving the Union. So do you understand how important that was, that more and more slave territory was opened to be part of the United States? And I've done some class here, I can't remember quite which one it was, it may have been the last one, about William Walker, the gray-eyed man of destiny, who he had a revolution in Nicaragua. He's from Nashville and became president of Nicaragua, but then of course he got overthrown and was shot in Ecuador or somewhere, and he didn't last very long in that country. But we were constantly interested in taking Cuba. We wanted Florida from Mexico, and we were constantly interested in Cuba. So a lot of things in American history would have been different before the Civil War. If without the 3/5 votes in the House, Missouri would have been a free state. Without the 3/5 vote in the House, Indian removal would not have passed Congress during the Jackson administration. The list of things goes on and on of what would not have happened had it not been for that Southern vote. So everybody was assuming that George Washington was going to be president. Nobody had any quibbles about that. I really think it would have been harder to create a one-person executive if they hadn't had this foregone conclusion that it was going to be George Washington. George Mason, a delegate to the convention from Virginia, had said, oh, I think we need 3 that are regionally distributed. Can you imagine 3 presidents? I mean, somebody, you know, what was it that George Bush said, I'm the decider? I mean, somebody eventually has to be the decider here. So knowing that Washington was the heir apparent and the only choice that they had ever really get unanimous consent for, they were happy to go along with a unitary president, with one person holding that job. So, Washington was elected president. He was very good at getting the administration going, this new government going, thanks to his cabinet members, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. They created an executive branch that worked. And most importantly, the economy of the 13 states went up. And with the economy going up, people were less restless, more satisfied than they had been before, and it certainly seemed that the government was able to keep order here after it got going. So the problem here that Washington didn't expect, and I think this really actually may have shortened Washington's life to some degree, he didn't realize that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were going to argue about every single detail. Now, you've got to understand that Jefferson is the big buddy of James Madison, who wrote the Virginia Plan. And he was in France as our minister to France while the Constitution was being written, but he supported ratification of this document, I think primarily because Madison had been so strongly involved in it. And he certainly wasn't opposing the Constitution. But from the get-go, every single thing that Hamilton proposed, Jefferson said no. And Jefferson compromised on one big thing, which was assuming the debt of the states. And he compromised on that because Hamilton was willing to give him a little something in return, which was the national capital being put on the Potomac River, right there in the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. Now, you know, one thing about the location of the capital, George Washington was always very non-committal in public about that. But he, as much as Jefferson and Madison and everybody else, wanted the capital in the South. Washington was sworn George Washington was sworn in New York City. I know some of y'all have walked by the building where he was sworn in, Federal Hall. You stand on the front porch of Federal Hall, you see the New York Stock Exchange right straight in front of you, and you see down at the end of this street is Broadway, where Trinity Church is, and that's where Washington was sworn in. The capital then moved to Philadelphia until this District of Columbia could be designed and built. And so it served in Philadelphia. Now, while Washington's president, he's going to Philadelphia. But here, remember, Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers. William Penn was a Quaker. And although it was probably the most diverse of the 13 original states, it was still a place where, from pretty much the beginning, slavery was frowned upon and then outright abolished. And so as this all unfolds, Philadelphia, while Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, and that's the seat of our government, Philadelphia passed an ordinance saying you couldn't, if any slave held in Philadelphia for more than 6 months, was automatically freed. Now, do you see what an imposition this is on Southerners? And you know, I mean, Washington has a cook, he's got a valet, he's got all these helpers that are slaves, and Jefferson had a whole bunch too, so did Madison, but they had to send their slaves home every 6 months and have a kind of a rotation. And in the case of one of Washington's slaves actually got away and declared himself to be free and lived for the rest of his life as a free man. So Washington doesn't want all of that dirty laundry out there soiling his image. But, you know, the slaveholders, I mean, yeah, they morally understood that it was wrong. I absolutely know they morally understood it was wrong, but they just couldn't help themselves because their lifestyle was predicated on that. So Washington you know, the story about how the compromise was made has been told over and over again in one of Joseph Ellis's books that talks about, one of the first chapters is about this dinner in New York City. But believe me, Jefferson and Madison were speaking on behalf of the president without calling their name. All right, Washington's president, things go well, but Jefferson and Hamilton are fighting. As a result of this, the Jeffersonians, who don't want the federal government doing very much, are calling these Hamiltonians Federalists, which, of course, Madison and Jefferson had been Federalists in terms of supporting ratification of the Constitution. And so the Federalists, they are calling the Jeffersonians, and the Jeffersonians like this. They are being called Republicans, meaning they support representative government. Then if you call them Democrats, they definitely did not like that term, because Democratic meant something, it had a negative connotation. It means the riffraff, the uneducated, the people at the bottom of the social pyramid having a say in this, which they didn't think should happen. You know, to vote, you had to own property for a good long period of time, and there were some other restrictions as well. So that we have the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Hamiltonian Federalists. And it really boiled down to the answer to the question, well, what do you want our national government to do? And Jefferson said, not very much. Jefferson wanted, his vision of this place was a nation of yeoman farmers. That's why we have to have this empire of liberty moving forward. And Hamilton wanted an industrial city, merchant class, active, robust economy that Jefferson didn't support at all. So I think the criticism ended up on George Washington when we get into foreign affairs trouble, mainly because the French Revolution began in 1789, right after Washington was sworn in as president. So a couple of things happened in Washington's administration, and these Jeffersonian newspaper editors were criticizing George Washington. So to everybody's surprise, in early 1796, Washington said, I am not running again. 2 terms is enough for me. I'm going back home to Mount Vernon. I'm a farmer. I'm leaving. And that was a surprise, because now we're going to have a contested election in 1796, and the cast of characters that are going to run are familiar folks, but they're going to be right there neck and neck in this election. So the vice president, John Adams, will run. We're going to call him a Federalist. I mean, see, Washington wasn't expecting political parties, and he actually denounced them in one of his last messages to Congress. Beware of breaking into these political factions. He denounced these things. So he was against this, but the Hamiltonian Federalist realized that Hamilton himself was too much of a lightning rod to get the nomination, and so they went to John Adams, the vice president, instead. And the Republicans nominated Thomas Jefferson to run. There was also Aaron Burr ran for president, and he ran as an anti-federalist. And some books refer to him in that first election of 1796 as an anti-federalist. But nonetheless, what happened in that election, they certainly didn't expect. You've elected a Federalist president, John Adams, and a Republican vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So right there was the first sign that the project, the way this had all been planned out, was not going to work quite as smoothly as had been expected, because you vote for 2 candidates. You're not voting for, this is about this. ballot in this left hand is for the president, and the one in the right hand is for vice president. You're just casting 2 votes and for 2 different people. And so whoever was the runner-up gets to be the vice president. Well, the Adams people did not like Jefferson after Jefferson had gotten so angry during Washington's administration. And this beautiful friendship that these 2 men had was completely ruptured for a long period of time from the Adams presidency to well after Jefferson's presidency.